They bulldozed it. The HOA demolished my lake fishing cabin for not paying their fake fishing club fees. The HOA president, Paula, just stood there in the wreckage with this smug look on her face, telling me I should have just paid up. This wasn't just a cabin. It was the last place I ever spent with my dad. She dared me to sue. What she didn't know is that while she was busy flexing her fake power, she was standing on my land. All of it. The docks, the clubhouse, the ground beneath her feet. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because this whole house of cards is about to come crashing down. And if you believe that every HOA bully deserves what's coming to them, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to watch justice get served cold. The old gravel road leading to the cabin felt the same as it always had. My truck's tires crunched over the stones, a familiar sound that settled my mind. It was early, just after sunrise, and a low mist hung over the lake like a blanket. I rolled the window down, and the air smelled of damp earth, pine, and fish, the smell of peace. Every time I made this drive, I felt my dad sitting in the passenger seat next to me. We'd built this place together, board by board, nail by nail, the year before I shipped out. It wasn't much, just one big room with a sturdy fireplace, a small kitchen counter, and a porch that looked out over the water. But it was ours. After Dad passed, it became more than just a cabin. It was a library of memories. I could still see him teaching me how to cast a line off the little wooden dock, his rough hands guiding mine. I could hear his laugh echoing off the water as I'd almost capsized the canoe. This place was the last piece of him I had left. I parked the truck under the big oak and stepped out, expecting to see the familiar slope of the cabin's roof. But it wasn't there. I stood frozen for a moment, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. Where the cabin should have been, there was just a pile of splintered wood, twisted metal roofing, and broken glass. It looked like a giant had stepped on it. The stone fireplace, the one we'd built with rocks we pulled from the lake bed, was a heap of rubble. The porch swing my dad had hung was a tangle of rope and shattered planks. A sick, hollow feeling spread through my chest, cold and heavy. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. A yellow bulldozer sat parked just beyond the debris, its blade caked with dirt and bits of what used to be my life. As I walked closer, a car door slammed shut. I turned to see a woman in a crisp, blue windbreaker walking toward me, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. It was Paula Remick, the self-appointed president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. Her smile was thin and tight, devoid of any warmth. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. She stopped a few feet away, making a show of looking at the destruction and then at me, her expression a perfect mask of fake sympathy. "Morning, Mr. Merritt," she said, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "Looks like the demolition crew was very efficient." I couldn't find my voice. I just stared at the wreckage, at the single birdhouse my dad had carved, now lying on its side in the dirt. She tapped her pen on the clipboard. "This is what happens when you ignore official notices. Fishing club non-compliance. Fee delinquency. You were warned, Jack. Several times." The words barely registered. Fishing club? I'd never joined her ridiculous club. My cabin wasn't even in her HOA. The property line for Lakeside Meadows stopped a quarter-mile down the road. My land, my dad's land, had been here 30 years before their cookie-cutter houses ever went up. I finally looked her in the eye. "Paula," I said, my voice low and steady, "this property isn't part of your association." She let out a small, condescending laugh. "Oh, that's where you're mistaken. We had our lawyers review the plat. It falls under implied inclusion due to its proximity to the community shoreline. You benefit from our lake maintenance, so you're obligated to contribute. It's all very standard." She made it sound so simple, so official. She knew most people would just get confused by the legal-sounding words and give up. She was counting on it. I'd seen her do it to my neighbors, fining old Mrs. Gable for having a bird feeder that wasn't on the approved list, and telling Earl his vegetable garden was a visual nuisance. She fed on this stuff. It made her feel important. "I'm not in your HOA," I repeated, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "I never agreed to join any club, and I'm sure as hell not paying fees for a service I don't want or need." Paula's smile vanished. The mask was off. Now it was just pure, smug satisfaction. She unclipped a thick stack of papers from her board and shoved them toward me. "Here are the violation notices, the final demand, and the demolition order, signed by the board. It's all perfectly legal." I didn't take the papers. They fluttered from her hand and scattered across the ruined ground. "You tore down my father's cabin," I said, the quiet reality of it hitting me again. She shrugged, a tiny, dismissive gesture that set a fire burning in my gut. "It was a dilapidated structure in violation of community standards. We're improving the aesthetic of the lakefront for our paying members." She gestured toward the pile of wood. "You should have it hauled away within the week. Otherwise, there will be another fine for debris." I looked at her, really looked at her. At her neat blonde hair, her expensive athletic shoes, her HOA logo stitched over her heart. She was a bully who had stumbled into a little bit of power and was squeezing it for all it was worth. She saw my silence as weakness. That's what people like her always do. They mistake calm for surrender. She straightened her windbreaker. Her job here done. She'd won. In her mind, the fight was over before it even began. "Sue us if you think you can," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Our lawyers are very good." Then she turned and walked back to her shiny SUV, leaving me standing in the ruins. I watched her drive away, dust kicking up behind her car. For a long time, I just stood there, breathing in the smell of torn-apart memories. I didn't yell. I didn't kick the rubble. The anger was there, but it was cold and sharp, not hot and loud. It was the kind of anger that doesn't just fade away. It's the kind that builds things. I walked away from the wreckage, got back in my truck, and drove home. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the cab was a heavy weight. When I got back to my house, I went straight to the old steel filing cabinet in my workshop. It was filled with blueprints, survey maps, and legal documents from my years as an engineer. In the bottom drawer, under a file labeled Personal, was a thick, folded document, brittle with age. It was the original deed to the lake property, the one my father signed back in 1974. I spread it out carefully on my workbench. My dad had been a stubborn, meticulous man. He'd read every line of every contract he ever signed. He'd told me once, "Jack, never let a man with a pen take what you built with your hands." I ran my finger over the dense typed words, the language precise and absolute. He hadn't just bought the plot of land for the cabin. He'd insisted on something more, something the developers at the time probably thought was pointless. Full mineral rights, full surface rights, and, most importantly, full shoreline rights, including ownership of a 20-foot buffer of land extending from the high water mark, encircling the entire lake. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who just found the blueprints for taking a bulldozer to someone else's world. Paula was right about one thing. Her lawyers were good. I was just hoping they were expensive. I remember the day Dad bought the land like it was yesterday. We were standing on that same spot, overlooking the undeveloped lake. I was a teenager then, more interested in skipping rocks than in property lines. A slick developer in a cheap suit was trying to rush him through the signing, talking about standard parcels and lake access. My dad just stood there, hands in his pockets, listening patiently. When the man finished his pitch, Dad pulled out a pen, but he didn't sign. He pointed to a clause in the contract. "This won't do," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't just want the plot, I want the shoreline." The developer laughed a little, "Mr. Merritt, nobody buys the shoreline. It's all designated for community use." My dad didn't blink. "Then I'm not buying the plot." He started to fold the papers. He explained it to the man like he was teaching a kid how to tie his shoes. He wanted a 20-foot strip of land, measured from the high water mark, that ran the entire circumference of the lake. The developer sputtered, saying it would be a surveying nightmare, that it was unheard of. Dad just waited. He knew the development company was over-leveraged and needed the cash from these first sales. "Son," he told me later, after the developer had finally caved and the new deed was drawn up, "land is the only thing they're not making more of. But a man's right to peace and quiet, they're always trying to take that. This little strip of dirt is an insurance policy. It guarantees no one can ever build right up on your doorstep or tell you where you can and can't fish." He was right. It was an insurance policy, and Paula Remick had just tried to cash it in for herself. That old deed was the key. But I needed to be sure. My dad was meticulous. But so were the kinds of lawyers HOAs hire to bend the rules. I spent the rest of the day in my workshop, the pile of splinters that was once my cabin burning in the back of my mind. This wasn't just about anger anymore. This was a structural problem, and I solve structural problems for a living. I scanned the original deed, with its old-fashioned meaties and bounds descriptions, and saved it as a high-resolution file. Then I pulled up the county's official plat map on my big monitor. I overlaid the HOA's development plan from the public record on top of it. For hours, I sat there, cross-referencing survey markers, tracing lines, and doing the math. And the more I looked, the wider my smile got. They hadn't just made a mistake. They'd built their entire little kingdom on a foundation of pure ignorance. The 20-foot buffer my dad had secured wasn't just a little patch in front of my cabin. It was a continuous, unbroken ring of private property around the whole lake. And sitting squarely on that ring was the pride of the Lakeside Meadows HOA. Their fancy new clubhouse, the one they held wine and cheese nights in, had its foundation poured 4 feet inside my property line. The series of fishing docks they'd built for their exclusive club were all anchored in my land. Their manicured picnic area, the one with the gas grills they charged members extra to use, was 100% on my territory. Even a portion of the stone gate and landscaped flower beds at their main entrance encroached on that 20-foot strip. They had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of their members' money trespassing. For years, the first call I made was to Kim Valdez. She was a sharp young engineer who'd worked under me for a few years before taking a job with the county land office. She knew how I operated. No small talk, just facts. "Kim, it's Jack Merritt," I said. "I've got a title question for you." I emailed her the scan of my dad's deed and the county's current plat map. I could hear her keyboard clicking on the other end. There was a long pause. "Well, I'll be," she said finally, a little laugh in her voice. "Jack, this is old ironclad language. Primary shoreline rights. A subsequent survey, like the one your HOA used, can't just ignore it or supersede it. They either didn't do a full title search, or they hoped no one would ever check. Your dad's deed is the controlling document. Officially, you own a 20-foot deep waterfront yard that wraps around the entire lake." That was all I needed to hear from her. My next call was to the county assessor's office. I gave them the parcel ID and asked a simple question. How are the structures on this shoreline being taxed? The man on the phone was confused. "What structures?" "Sir, that entire 20-foot buffer is zoned as undeveloped private land, and it's taxed at the lowest possible rate under your name." So, not only was the HOA trespassing, they weren't paying a dime in property taxes on their clubhouse or docks, because as far as the county was concerned, those buildings didn't exist. My last call was to a guy I knew who specialized in unraveling messy land trusts and tax foreclosures. I just had a few general questions for him. A little reconnaissance for later. He gave me the answers I was looking for. The HOA wasn't just a house of cards. It was built on borrowed land with imaginary money. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, I loaded the back of my truck. I had a post-hole digger, a sledgehammer, and a stack of 50 wooden stakes. I'd spent the afternoon cutting and painting a bright, impossible-to-miss red. To each one, I'd bolted a professionally laminated sign. The text was simple, black on a white background, no room for confusion. Private property. Pursuant to county record, deed number. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I started at the edge of my ruined cabin plot and worked my way around the lake. Every 50 feet, I drove a new stake deep into the ground. I measured precisely, using the GPS on my phone, to stay exactly on the property line Kim had confirmed. I staked off the edge of their manicured lawns. I put a stake right in the middle of their prize-winning rose garden. I hammered one in just inches from the front door of their clubhouse, right where Paula would trip over it on her way to the next emergency meeting. I put stakes at the entrance to every single one of their fishing docks, blocking access. The work was hard and quiet. The only sounds were the thud of the hammer and the chirping of crickets. It was past 2 a.m. by the time I hammered in the last stake. I stood back and looked at my work. A necklace of bright red markers now encircled the entire lake, a stark, clear boundary. It was a silent declaration that the rules had changed. Their fake little world now had a very real fence around it, and they were about to find out they were on the wrong side. The phone rang at 6 o'clock the next morning. It was Earl. He wasn't one for small talk. "Jack," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you'd better get down here. The Queen Bee is having a meltdown." I didn't need to ask who he meant. I poured a cup of black coffee into a thermos and was in my truck in 5 minutes. When I got to the lake, it was chaos. Not loud chaos, but the quiet, tense kind that happens in suburbs. Neighbors were standing in their driveways, looking confused. Paula was marching up and down the shoreline, her clipboard in hand, pointing at my red stakes like they were enemy flags. Her little sidekick, the security guard who called himself Deputy Steve, was trailing behind her, looking important in his tactical vest. As I watched from a distance, he walked up to old Mr. Henderson's property and slapped a piece of paper on his door. I called Earl, who was watching from his porch. "What's going on?" I asked. "She's fining people," Earl grumbled. "Henderson just got a $50 ticket for trespassing on community shoreline because his lawnmower wheels crossed your new property line. She's telling everyone you've illegally fenced off public land. It was a classic bully move. If you can't hit your target, hit everyone around them. Turn the neighbors against me by making them pay for my actions." By lunchtime, every resident had a letter in their mailbox. Earl brought his over for me to read. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive nonsense, written in Paula's signature condescending tone. It called me a disgruntled individual and a known squatter. It claimed my hostile and unauthorized fencing was a danger to children and was depressing property values. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat. "The board advises residents to avoid any interaction with this individual for your own safety, and to report any suspicious activity immediately." She was painting me as a monster, a crazy old man who'd just snapped. And for some people, it was working. They looked at the red stakes, they looked at their violation notices, and they saw me as the problem. Late in the afternoon, a news van from the local station pulled up. Paula must have called them herself. She met the reporter with a practiced look of concern on her face, like a worried mayor addressing her frightened citizens. She pointed at my ruined cabin site, calling it an unstable structure I was forced to remove for public safety. Then she gestured to the stakes. "This man is trying to steal our lake," she said, her voice trembling just enough. "He's holding our community hostage." The camera lapped it all up. But while Paula was busy playing for the cameras, I was playing the long game. She was fighting a war of words. I was preparing to change the facts on the ground. My first stop was the VFW hall downtown. I met with the head of a local charity that takes disabled veterans out fishing. I explained the situation, laid out my dad's deed, and made them a proposal. I would grant their organization exclusive, long-term access rights to the entire 20-foot shoreline, free of charge. They could build accessible docks, hold events, and use the lakefront whenever they wanted. All I asked in return was that they help me maintain it. The chairman, a retired Marine colonel with eyes that had seen everything, looked at the map, then looked at me, and broke into a grin. "Mr. Merritt," he said, shaking my hand, "I think our boys would be honored to help you defend your property line." We signed the papers that same day. Legally, the shoreline was now in use by a registered nonprofit. It would be a lot harder for Paula to claim it was abandoned or public land when there were veterans in wheelchairs casting lines from it. My next step was about evidence. I spent the next afternoon installing a series of high-definition, motion-activated cameras. They were small, discreet, and positioned in trees overlooking the entire shoreline, especially the areas around the HOA clubhouse and docks. They fed directly to a secure server, and I could watch the live feed from my phone. But the real masterpiece was the signs. I took down the simple laminated warnings and replaced them. My new signs were digital, solar-powered, and mounted on steel posts. Each one displayed a clear, easy-to-read message: private property, access by licensed agreement only. But below that, I had a programmer help me set up something special. A live, satellite-linked map of the immediate area was displayed on the screen, with a bright red line showing the exact GPS-confirmed property boundary. A little blue dot showed your current location. If you stepped over the line, the dot turned red, and the sign emitted a polite, audible chime. "You have entered private property." There was no more arguing. There was just data. I finished installing the last sign just as the sun was setting. The war of words was over. Now it was a war of facts. And my facts were displayed on weatherproof screens and backed up by satellite. I went home, feeling like I'd finally laid a proper foundation. I was watching the 10 o'clock news, where they were running a short segment on Paula's community under siege story, when my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from camera 4, the one pointed directly at the stake I'd planted in front of the clubhouse door. I pulled up the live feed, and there she was. Paula Remick, dressed in her official blue HOA windbreaker, was standing in the dark. She looked left, then right, clearly thinking no one was watching. Then, she grabbed my new steel signpost with both hands and tried to wrench it out of the ground. It didn't budge. She grunted, her face twisting in frustration. She kicked the base of it. Then, she grabbed one of the original wooden survey stakes and began yanking at it, her whole body shaking with the effort. The stake finally came loose from the soil. She held it up like a trophy for a moment before throwing it into the bushes. She had no idea she was the star of her very own primetime show, broadcast directly to my phone, her HOA logo windbreaker, perfectly illuminated by the clubhouse porch light. I hit record. I saved the video of Paula yanking at my property stake. It wasn't for blackmail. I wasn't going to plaster it all over the internet. That wasn't my style. For me, that video was like a weather report. It was data. It confirmed the high-pressure system of her ego was becoming unstable, and that a storm was coming. But a good engineer doesn't just watch the storm. He checks the foundation of the building it's about to hit. While she was busy drafting nasty emails and trying to turn the neighborhood against me, I was back in my workshop, making another set of quiet phone calls. My conversation with the tax specialist had planted an idea in my head, a little nagging question that I couldn't shake. An HOA like this, so focused on image and control, usually has a fancy, landscaped entrance, a solid-looking clubhouse, and ample parking. But building all that costs money, and it requires land. My dad's deed gave me the shoreline, but what about the path to get there? I spent 2 days digging through the county's online records, following a tangled web of deeds, trusts, and old development plans from the 80s. And then I found it. It was a dusty little corner of the county's digital basement. A single, oddly shaped parcel of land, officially designated as an easement. It wasn't much, just a long, narrow strip that connected the main road to the lakefront. It was the land the HOA's paved access road was on. It was the land their gravel parking lot sat on. It was the land where the first 20 feet of their precious clubhouse stood. But the parcel wasn't owned by the Lakeside Meadows HOA. It wasn't owned by any of the residents. It was owned by a defunct land trust, set up by the original developers, a company that had gone out of business 15 years ago. And, according to the county tax office, they hadn't paid a penny in property taxes on that easement in over a decade. It was a ghost on the books, a legal orphan nobody had claimed. The HOA had just been using it, assuming it was theirs. They'd built on it, paved it, and landscaped it, all without ever checking the title. It was the single artery that fed their entire lakefront operation, and it was about to have a massive heart attack. Through my tax foreclosure contact, I found out the delinquent tax bill for the land was up for public auction. It wasn't a glamorous process. There were no gavels or shouting auctioneers. It was a quiet, bureaucratic procedure handled through sealed bids. So, I set up a simple LLC. I called it Shoreline Management LLC, something boring and official sounding, and I put in a bid. I offered the full amount of the back taxes, plus all the associated penalties and fees. It wasn't a small amount of money, but I considered it an investment in peace and quiet. 3 weeks later, I got a certified letter from the county. The land was mine. The title was clean. I was now the proud owner of the ground underneath the HOA's clubhouse, their parking lot, and their only road to the lake. I held the deed in my hand. It was a modern document, printed on a laser printer, nothing like my dad's old one, but it held just as much power. The rumors started a few days later. A new name had appeared on the county plat map, and someone on the HOA's Architectural Review Committee had noticed. Whispers went around that a corporate developer had bought the access road. People started to panic. Earl called me. "Jack, they're losing their minds over here," he said, a note of pure joy in his voice. The board had some kind of emergency text chain going all night. 2 of them are already talking about resigning. They think someone's going to put up a toll booth. The HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking guy from a downtown firm, sent me a threatening letter full of big words like prescriptive easement and adverse possession. He demanded I sign the land over to the HOA immediately for the sum of $1. I forwarded the letter to Kim at the county office. Her reply was short and sweet. Their claim is baseless. A prescriptive easement can't be established against a property that's been tax delinquent. The tax sale wiped out any prior claims. The title is yours, free and clear. Tell him to pound sand. I didn't tell him to pound sand. I just didn't reply at all. Paula, predictably, went on the offensive. A new, frantic letter appeared in everyone's mailbox. This one was dripping with righteous fury. She called me a predatory real estate speculator who was weaponizing the law to terrorize our families. She accused me of a hostile takeover and promised the residents that the board would fight this illegal land grab with every resource they had. The letter ended with an appeal for a special emergency fund to cover the coming legal battle. She was trying to frame this as an attack on the whole community, with her as their brave defender. But her power was built on the illusion of control, and that illusion was crumbling. People were starting to ask questions. Questions like, how could the board let someone buy the land out from under them? And why had they been paying for the upkeep of a road they never even owned? The ground, both literally and figuratively, was shifting beneath her feet. I let them stew in their own panic for another week. I wanted the pressure to build. Then, on a Friday morning, I went down to the post office. I had a stack of 112 envelopes. Each one was a certified letter, requiring a signature upon delivery. Each one was addressed to a different homeowner in the Lakeside Meadows community. Inside each envelope was a single sheet of paper, printed with the official letterhead of Shoreline Management LLC. The text was calm, professional, and brutally clear. It read, "Effective immediately. Your access to the lake, the community clubhouse, and the adjacent parking facilities via the private road known as Lakeside Lane is suspended. This action is due to unresolved trespassing and liability issues. This suspension will remain in effect pending the negotiation of individual access license agreements with the property owner. To begin the negotiation process for your household, please contact the property owner at the address below to request terms." I slid the stack of letters across the counter to the postal clerk. She looked at them, then at me. "Looks like someone's having a busy day," she said. I just smiled. They are now. The certified letters landed like a bomb. The HOA called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday night. They booked the community clubhouse, apparently forgetting they were now just uninvited guests on my property. I almost put up a no trespassing sign at the end of the access road just for the fun of it, but Earl talked me out of it. "No, Jack," he said. "You've got to go. You walk in there and face them. Let them see you're not afraid." He was right. Hiding would make me look weak. So, on Tuesday night, I put on a clean shirt, grabbed a thick manila folder, and walked right through the front door of the clubhouse. The place was packed. It was standing room only, with people spilling out onto the porch. The air was thick with anger, confusion, and fear. Every resident of Lakeside Meadows was there, holding my letter in their hands. The local news crew was back, their camera light a harsh glare in the corner of the room. This was exactly what Paula wanted, a public spectacle, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to go the way she'd planned. She was standing at a podium at the front of the room, looking flustered but defiant. The other board members sat behind her at a long table, each of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. When I walked in, a hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. I saw suspicion in some, but in others, I saw something else, a flicker of hope. I just nodded politely and found a spot to stand against the back wall. Paula tapped the microphone, a shrill feedback squeal cutting through the silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, trying to sound calm and in control. "As you know, our community is under attack by a hostile outside entity." She never used my name, always referring to me as "this individual" or "the corporation." She launched into a 10-minute tirade, waving a copy of my letter. She called it a fake document, full of legal-sounding gibberish. She claimed my purchase of the land was a fraudulent backroom deal, and that the real deeds proved the land belonged to the HOA. She promised them, her voice rising with emotion, that the board would not be intimidated by this shakedown, this illegal land grab. The whole time, she never once looked at me. When she finished, the room was buzzing. A few of her supporters clapped, but most people just looked more confused than ever. "We'll now open the floor to questions for the board," she announced, clearly expecting softballs from her friends. Instead, a hand shot up in the front row. It was a man I recognized as a local firefighter, a guy named Dave. "Paula," he said, his voice loud and clear, "my wife got a $100 fine from you last month for hanging laundry on a Sunday. You cited bylaw 14C. Now you're telling us the bylaws about land ownership don't matter? Which is it?" The room went dead silent. Paula stammered for a moment. That's an entirely different issue. We're talking about an external threat." "No," Dave cut her off. "I'm talking about the rules. Do they apply to you? Or just to us?" Before she could answer, I pushed off from the back wall and started walking toward the front. "Perhaps I can clear some things up," I said, my voice calm and even. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I walked up to the podium, and Paula had no choice but to step aside, her face a mask of fury. I didn't need the microphone. I turned to face the residents, my neighbors. "My name is Jack Merritt. I said simply. My father and I built a cabin on this lake a long time ago. Your HOA tore it down. The letter you all received is not fake. It's very real. From my folder, I pulled out a series of large, poster-sized documents I'd had printed at a copy shop. I set up an easel I had brought with me and placed the first one on it. It was a high-resolution aerial photograph of the entire Lakeside Meadows development. This is your neighborhood, I said. Then I placed a clear plastic overlay on top of it. On the plastic, a bright red line marked the 20-foot shoreline buffer. This red line, I continued, pointing, is my property line, according to the original deed recorded in 1974. I then used a marker to circle the clubhouse, the docks, and the picnic area. All of them were clearly inside the red line. A low murmur went through the crowd. I replaced that exhibit with the next one, a certified copy of the county plat map. This is the official map from the county records office, I said. I pointed to my land, then to the easement for the access road, clearly marked under a different parcel number. I then put up the final document, a certified copy of the new deed, showing Shoreline Management LLC as the sole owner of that easement. Your HOA never owned this land, I explained. They built on it, but they never owned it. They trespassed on my shoreline, and they trespassed on the land trust's access road. The only difference is, now, I own the road. I turned to the board. You never did a proper title search. You never paid taxes on the land you were using. You operated on assumptions, and you were wrong. Just then, a woman I didn't recognize stood up. It was Kim Valdez, my friend from the county office. He's right, she said, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. I'm a civil engineer with the county. I've personally reviewed all of these documents. Mr. Merritt's deeds are legally sound and supersede any claims made by the HOA's development plan. The property lines are exactly as he has shown them. That was the turning point. The room erupted. The anger was no longer directed at me. It was aimed squarely at the podium where Paula was standing. Speechless. People started shouting, "You used our dues to build on land you didn't own?" One woman yelled, "How much did your lawyers cost us for this mess?" shouted another. The firefighter Dave stood up again. "You told us he was a squatter. You lied to all of us." Paula grabbed the microphone. "This is all a misunderstanding. It's a clerical error. We will fix this." But nobody was listening anymore. The illusion of her power was gone, shattered by a few simple, undeniable facts on a poster board. I held up my hand for quiet. The room slowly settled down. I looked at Paula, then at the rest of the board. "This isn't about a clerical error," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "This is about abuse of power. You fined your neighbors for the color of their mailboxes while you were illegally occupying land you had no right to. As of tonight, your HOA, your clubhouse, your fishing club are all trespassing. Your docks come down next week." A gasp went through the crowd. I packed up my folder, folded my easel, and turned to walk out. The silence as I left was more powerful than any shouting. It was the sound of a kingdom that had just watched its throne turn to dust. I thought the meeting would be the end of it. I figured Paula would see the writing on the wall, resign in disgrace, and the HOA would crawl back to me, hat in hand, to negotiate access. I underestimated her desperation. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Paula's entire identity was cornered. Losing the HOA meant she was just a divorced woman in a big house with nothing to do. She wasn't going to let go that easily. The day after the meeting, her lawyer filed a massive counterclaim against me. It was a work of pure fiction. It accused me of conspiracy, fraud, and a half-dozen other things, claiming my dad's deed was a forgery and my purchase of the easement was the result of a corrupt bargain with county officials. It was a legal smokescreen, designed to be so complicated and expensive that I'd just give up. At the same time, she sent a letter to the county clerk's office. It claimed the HOA had held a unanimous community vote granting them ownership of the shoreline in perpetuity. It was a complete lie, of course. No such vote ever happened. She was trying to muddy the waters, to create a paper trail of fake documents, hoping one of them might stick. But I've learned a thing or two about desperate people over the years. They always overplay their hand, and they always think about money. On a hunch, I hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, serious woman who specialized in untangling the finances of small businesses and nonprofits. I gave her the HOA's publicly available tax filings and a simple instruction: follow the money. While the accountant got to work, I started clearing the land where my cabin once stood. The pile of wreckage was a constant reminder of what started all of this, and I wanted it gone. Earl came over to help, and so did Dave, the firefighter from the meeting. Word had gotten around. We spent the day loading splintered wood into a rented dumpster, a small crew working under the warm Sunday. It felt good to be building something again, even if it was just a clean slate. People I barely knew would drive by, honk their horns, and give me a thumbs up. The tide of public opinion had turned completely. Paula wasn't a brave leader anymore. She was the neighborhood problem. The accountant called me 2 days later. "Mr. Merritt," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "you were right to be suspicious. There's a pattern here." She explained that for the past 2 years, large sums of money had been moved from the HOA's main account into a separate landscaping and beautification fund. From there, checks were being written to a company called Remick Horticultural Services. The problem? Remick Horticultural Services didn't exist. The address it was registered to was a P.O. box, and the sole proprietor was Paula Remick. She had been paying herself with HOA dues for imaginary gardening work. But it got worse. The day after the disastrous community meeting, she had tried to transfer the entire remaining balance of the HOA's bank account, over $60,000, into her personal account. The bank, seeing such a large and unusual transfer, had flagged it and put a temporary hold on the funds. Paula was trying to drain the ship before it sank. With that information, everything moved quickly. My lawyer took the accountant's report straight to the district attorney. An emergency injunction was filed. By 5 o'clock that evening, a sheriff's deputy was knocking on Paula's front door. He served her with a court order freezing every bank account associated with the Lakeside Meadows HOA. He also handed her a thick stack of papers: a cease and desist order, a notice of a pending investigation for fraud and embezzlement, and a personal restraining order that legally barred her from setting foot on any of my properties, which now included the shoreline and the access road. Her entire kingdom had been declared off-limits to the Queen. I watched it happen from one of my security camera feeds. She screamed at the deputy, called him names, and threatened to have his badge. He just stood there, stone-faced, and waited until she was done. Then he got back in his car and drove away. Her last move was one of pure, irrational spite. Later that night, long after dark, my phone buzzed with another motion alert. This time it was from the camera I'd set up overlooking the cleared cabin site. I pulled up the feed, my heart pounding. There she was, a dark figure moving through the shadows, holding a flashlight. It was Paula. She was dressed in black, her face a pale oval in the camera's night vision. The restraining order was in her pocket, and she was already violating it. She walked across the freshly raked earth, kicking at the new foundation stakes I'd just laid out. She was inspecting the site, no doubt looking for some imaginary violation she could use against me. She seemed to think if she could just find one thing I'd done wrong, her own crimes would disappear. I dialed 911. "I'd like to report a trespasser in violation of a restraining order," I said, my voice as calm as I could make it. I gave them the address and a description. I told them she was on site, right now. 2 patrol cars were there in less than 10 minutes, their blue and red lights flashing silently through the trees. They caught her red-handed, standing right in the middle of my property, a startled deer in the headlights of their cruisers. I watched on my phone as the officers approached her, I could see her arguing, waving her arms, her voice too faint for the camera's microphone to pick up. But I knew what she was saying. I'm the president. This is my authority. You can't do this. One of the officers, a tall woman with a no-nonsense look, took out a pair of handcuffs. Paula's protests grew louder, more frantic. "This is harassment," she screamed, her voice finally carrying to the camera's mic. Just then, a light flicked on at the house next door. It was Dave, the firefighter. He stepped out onto his porch. "No, ma'am," he called out across the darkness, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "This is justice." The officer snapped the cuffs onto Paula's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the quiet night air. They led her to the patrol car, her head bowed, the fight finally gone out of her. It wasn't the way I thought this would end, with flashing lights and handcuffs. But as I watched them drive away, leaving the lake in silence once again, I knew my dad would have understood. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring order. It was about making sure that no one with a clipboard could ever again tear down what a man had built with his own two hands. The aftermath of Paula's arrest was swift and decisive. It was like pulling the kingpin out of a rickety structure. The whole thing just collapsed on itself. She resigned as HOA president the next day from her lawyer's office, citing personal health reasons. Facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and violating a court order, her little paper empire was the least of her worries. The rest of the board members, seeing the threat of being named in a civil suit for mismanagement, resigned in a single, panicked email chain. Within a week, the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. There was no one left to enforce the rules about bird feeders or lawn ornaments. The whole silly edifice of control crumbled into dust overnight. The legal process took a few months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was too clear, the facts too solid. The court ruled entirely in my favor. The judge ordered that all of my legal and professional fees, the lawyer, the accountant, the surveyors, be reimbursed. He didn't order the defunct HOA to pay. He made Paula and the former board members personally liable for the costs out of their own pockets. The judge's ruling also stipulated that funds from the HOA's frozen accounts, once cleared of any fraudulent activity, were to be used to fund the complete rebuilding of my cabin to the exact specifications of the original, with an additional sum for emotional distress. The final point was my lawyer's idea, and it was a quiet little masterpiece of poetic justice. The court ordered that a formal, public apology to me and the community be posted on the homepage of the HOA's official website, and it was to remain there, unaltered, for 1 full year. The website, which Paula had once used to post threatening notices and public shamings, now featured a single plain text page admitting their overreach, their illegal actions, and their profound regret. It was a digital monument to their failure. But the most amazing thing happened, not in the courtroom, but on the land itself. The day after the final ruling, I went down to the cabin site with a set of blueprints and a truck full of lumber. I was ready to start the slow work of rebuilding, alone. I hadn't been there for an hour when Earl pulled up in his old pickup. He got out with a tool belt slung over his shoulder and a thermos of coffee in his hand. "Figured you could use an extra hand," he said, not asking, just stating a fact. A little while later, Dave the firefighter showed up with 2 other guys from his station. They brought their own circular saws. By noon, there were a dozen people there. Neighbors who I'd only ever nodded to were showing up with hammers, coolers full of water, and boxes of donuts. The local hardware store owner, who'd heard the story, dropped off a pallet of roofing shingles and just said, "Pay me when you can." The veterans fishing charity I'd partnered with sent a whole crew of volunteers, guys who knew how to build, how to work, and how to get a job done without any fuss. We rebuilt my father's cabin in 3 weeks. What had taken him and me an entire summer to build, this small army of neighbors and strangers raised in a matter of days. It was better than the original, The foundation was stronger, the joints were tighter, the roof was perfect. But the spirit was the same. Every board was nailed in place not with malice, but with a shared sense of purpose. We weren't just rebuilding a cabin. We were reclaiming the community from the petty tyranny that had infected it. We were proving that a neighborhood is about the people in it, not the rules written in a binder. The HOA clubhouse sat empty, a monument to a forgotten regime. The fishing docks, now officially on my land, were repaired and opened up to everyone. There were no more clubs, no more fees, no more approved guest lists. In place of the HOA, we formed a simple, voluntary lake cooperative. Everyone chips in a little bit for maintenance, and everyone has a say. We use the old clubhouse for potlucks and kids' birthday parties now. We decided to name the co-op after my dad, the Merritt Lake Association. It felt right. Last Saturday, I was sitting on the porch of the new cabin, just watching the water. The evening was quiet, the air cool. A young boy and his grandfather were down on one of the docks, the same one where my dad had taught me to fish. The boy was struggling with his cast, his line tangling in a mess. The grandfather knelt beside him, his hands patiently guiding the boys, just like my dad had done for me. After a few minutes, the boy got the hang of it and managed a long, clean cast out into the deep water. As they stood there, waiting for a bite, the grandfather looked up toward the cabin and saw me. He raised his hand in a small wave. "Thanks," he called out, his voice carrying over the water. "Thank you for all this, for saving the lake." I just nodded and smiled. I didn't save the lake. We all did. I didn't take Paula's power away from her. She gave it up the second she thought no one would have the strength to fight back.